They say the Nahual carries the night on its back. But no one warns that when the night learns your name, it never forgets it. And for 40 years, Santiago Romero fed the darkness without knowing what it wanted. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and tell in the comments where you watching from and what time is it. The archives of Veracruz hold little on the man. One passport, 2 grainy photographs, and a handwritten hunting license stamped with the insignia of the state, issued 1951, revoked 1952. Past that, the pages curl inward like leaves burned too close to a flame. His own family refused to keep records, and when the interviewers came decades later, all they found were shuttered windows and candles left to smolder beneath framed saints. He died in a room that smelled of damp wood and cedar incense, whispering a name none of them understood. And still the Nahual never came for them. It came for him alone. He was 19 when he first met it, though he would not know its face for many years. He was a firewood gatherer then, earning pesos by carrying rough logs from the high hills down to the fisherman's market. The mountains above Catemaco were a different country from the port, saturated with a wet green darkness that swallowed light. The elders called that world La Sierra Dormida, the sleeping range, its valleys creviced with mist, its jaguars tracking silently through the undergrowth. Even then, Santiago claimed the hills had a pulse when no wind was present, a faint thrum beneath the soil like the breath of a creature too large to be seen. It began one evening as the sun collapsed behind the ridges, bleeding crimson through the palmettos. Santiago had stayed too long in the cedar groves, wrestling with logs made heavy by the recent rains. He remembered how the air thickened, how the frogs retreated into silence. A gray-brown blur moved at the edge of the brush. He thought it a coyote at first until the shape stood on its hind legs. He ran. Not because he feared death but because the thing did not chase him. It only watched. Men could outrun predators, he told himself. They could not outpace eyes that never blinked. He slipped on stones, slid through mud, tore his palms on thorn branches. When he reached the entrance to the nearest village, his lungs buckled and his vision clouded as though he had been forced underwater. A lone lantern burned at the shrine of Santa Rosa. He collapsed beneath it, trembling. No one saw the creature. No one believed the boy. The healer at the edge of the settlement scolded him for working after dusk and smeared his wounds with eucalyptus oil. "The mountain plays tricks on tired eyes," she said, placing 2 dried maize husks at the threshold of her door. "Only fools rush into the dusk with arms full and a mind empty." But Santiago felt the stare of the Nahual on the back of his skull long after the scratches healed. For weeks, his dreams fevered with amber eyes that glowed behind the cedar trunks, with claws scraping bark, with an animal's breath steaming in the half-light. It was no coyote. Not even a jaguar. There was intent in the way it waited, the posture of something that recognized ownership. Then came the offering. Old men in Catemaco talk of the Nahual as if it were a shepherd of darkness, a guardian beast shaped by forgotten rites. In their stories it does not hunt for meat, it hunts for the familiar. It takes what you already hold in your hands. If you carry salt, it will ask for salt. If you carry water, it will demand water. If you carry fear, it will drink you hollow until your bones remember nothing but trembling. Santiago carried maize that night. Not because he meant to feed anything. He had accepted a small sack from a farmer on the ridge as payment for helping mend a gate. The sun was setting, the air humid, and he promised to deliver it down valley. But halfway through the path, the cicadas stopped. The woods turned ash-cold. The trees leaned inward. He did not run this time, not until the shape stepped through the clearing and exhaled. The sound was low, rhythmic, the cadence of a creature mimicking speech without any need for language. When he lifted the sack in trembling hands, it did not move toward him. It only waited. He laid the maize at the base of an agave and backed away slowly, inch by inch. The creature approached and bowed its head. The next morning the maize was gone. Only claw marks remained, 3 deep grooves carved into the soil as though the ground had protested the taking. Santiago swore he would never return. Yet hunger is a cruel tutor. The wood carriers earned little, food was scarcer in the rainy season, and the sea paid better for those who could haul nets. But he was not a fisherman. His hands were made for lifting timber, and the mountains pressed their weight upon him until he learned their paths blindfolded. Every few nights, when the sky bled copper and the frogs fell silent, he would leave offerings. Not out of devotion but to buy passage. Maize became tortillas. Tortillas became dried fish. Dried fish became whole chickens smuggled from pens on the outskirts of the village. Each time he left the food and walked away without looking back. Each time the Nahual fed. And each time the forest exhaled behind him. Years bent like branches under wind. Santiago grew into a man whose back curved from carrying secrets. He married a woman whose name the archives do not record, and whose face is missing from every photograph the family preserved. She died in childbirth, leaving behind a daughter who learned her father's silences before she learned his words. The neighbors whispered that grief had carved his lungs into a pair of hollow gourds. Only the hills heard the truth. Grief was merely the latest offering. By then the Nahual no longer stayed at the edge of the trees. It followed him. He would feel it on the ridge, padding behind him like a shadow. He would sense it on the footpaths, pausing when he paused. Some hunters reported seeing a tall figure in the cedars at dusk, walking upright beside a man who carried no lantern. They spoke of glowing eyes that blinked too slowly, of breath that curled white even when the air was warm. Santiago never corrected them. He did not speak of it at all. Not to the priest who offered exorcisms, not to the fishermen who mocked him in the taverns, not to his own daughter when she asked why they never traveled after sundown. He only added more food to the offerings, as though its hunger could be satisfied through discipline alone. 40 years passed. The Nahual never harmed him. And that, the elders insist, was the greatest warning of all. There are few accounts of the Nahual that speak of patience. Most paint it as a sudden terror, a beast that rips the throat from a mule, or snatches a child who wanders too far from the village fire. Yet patience is the language of predators that know their prey will return. And Santiago returned to the hills as a debtor walks back to the door of a lender who never needs to raise his voice. In the 1960s, the Veracruz Mountains went through a period the elders still call Los Años en que la tierra exudaba sangre, the years when the earth sweated blood. Landslides peeled away slopes after every rainstorm, swallowing paths and revealing bones buried long before the settlers arrived. The state sent inspectors, engineers, and a handful of soldiers with weather-beaten rifles to survey the damage. Roads were planned, camps were set up, and prayers were offered to saints whose names meant nothing to the ridges they were meant to pacify. Santiago watched all of this from the periphery. He was no longer a youth by then, thick-bearded, broad in the shoulders, and strong enough to carry cedar trunks from ravines where younger men refused to enter. The others said he had the eyes of someone who had spent too long listening for footsteps that never quite landed. A man who stared at the horizon even when he was speaking to you. The women who sold fruit at the market stalls said he had inherited the sorrow of the mountains. It was around this time that the Nahual stopped taking offerings where he left them. The first sign was small, almost insignificant. He laid a basket of smoked fish at the old agave, the same spot he had used for years, and returned at dawn to find it untouched. The second instance was stranger still. He left a chicken, a fresh kill from a farmer who owed him a favor, and found it dragged several meters away, placed upon a bed of large stones as though arranged with intention. The blood, instead of soaking into the ground, was spread in a thin crescent that glistened beneath the morning sun. No teeth had torn flesh. Nothing had been eaten. Santiago's palms sweated. He knew instinctively what the elders had always hinted. The Nahual did not hunger only for meat. The offerings had been its way of teaching him obedience. Now it wanted something else. He took to wandering the ridgeline at night, not to confront it, but to understand it. The moon was a chipped coin above the valleys, its pale light fizzing against the fog that coiled through the cedar stands. He heard no growl, no movement. Only the slow inhale and exhale of a beast that had learned to mimic stillness. Some nights, he felt it beside him without seeing it. Other nights, he felt it behind him, as though inspecting whether his stride matched the one it had given him. When dawn came, he would wake with memories pressed into his bones like bruises. He could not recall seeing the creature directly, yet he remembered that its shadow had length, and that the trees bent when it passed. He remembered the outline of claws that made no sound. The heaviness of air when it paused. The rush of insects fleeing its path. Even dreams could not hold such details so clearly. Something had begun to change between them. Word spread in the nearby villages that Santiago was befriended by the night, a phrase uttered with the same tone used to describe a man standing too close to a cliff's edge. Children dared one another to follow him up the trails. None lasted more than a few minutes in the timberlands before retreating, dizzy with panic. Fishermen refused to walk the upper paths and blamed him for every missing goat, every drowned dog, every sudden disappearance of hens. They sharpened hooks, carved crosses into cedar bark, and spat whenever he passed the taverns. Santiago ignored them. He had learned long ago that fear makes people louder than danger ever does. His daughter, now a young woman with the quiet eyes of her mother, did not ignore them. She saw the way the villagers recoiled. She heard the muttered accusations, the chain of gossip that twisted his name into a curse. She asked him, sitting beneath the thatched roof where rainwater dripped like beads from a rosary, why they lived as though something hunted them. He did not answer her question. He lifted her chin and said only that one must respect the hills as one respects the ocean. Drownings are not punishments. They are consequences. Was not enough. A daughter learns her father's lies the same way she learns his footsteps. Late that summer, disaster came in the shape of a storm that tore roofs from homes, uprooted coffee plants, and pushed whole sections of the mountain down the ravines. The landslide carved a path through the ridge Santiago often walked. Trees folded like paper. The ground split. And when the villagers sent search crews to find missing livestock and lost travelers, they saw something they could not explain. A line of paw prints, each the width of a grown man's hand, tracked through the fresh mud toward the cedar groves. They were too large for wolves, too wide for pumas. Some prints sank so deeply that the soil exhaled water when touched. The searchers refused to continue. They hurried back to town, crossed themselves and locked their doors. Santiago went out alone. The prince led him along a half-collapsed path, through wind-snapped branches and shattered limestone, until the fog thickened to a milk-white shroud. The air smelled of wet cedar and iron. He did not call out, not from bravery but because he already knew it was there. He felt its presence before he reached the clearing, a pulse of pressure in the skull like a warning drum. The Nahual waited on a rise of stone, upright as a man, its body draped in a coat of dusk-colored fur. Its limbs were too long, its claws curved inward, and its head tilted with the slow, unblinking curiosity of a creature examining something it had raised from infancy. Its eyes, the amber eyes he had seen only in fragments, glowed as though lit from the inside. For the first time in 40 years, it approached him without waiting for an offering. He did not run. He did not kneel. He held its gaze and understood that the creature was not asking for food. It was asking for witness. The third day after the storm, the villagers began to whisper another name for Santiago. They did not know the word Nahual as the elders knew it. They called him El Guardian del Brujo, the keeper of a sorcerer, as though the beast were merely a man with claws instead of hands. Fear makes language small. What it cannot comprehend, it folds into something familiar. A devil becomes a priest gone wrong. A god becomes a man with too much hunger. A Nahual becomes a sorcerer stalking the hills. Santiago did not correct them. To speak the creature's true name was to invite its gaze, and he would not burden the town with the weight he carried. Instead, he walked the ridge at dusk, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his breath a thin mist above the treeline. The skies burned with orange, then bruised into violet, then blackened into the long hours when the creature moved freely. He knew the land better than the surveyors who came after the storm. They drew maps and pinned red markers, but the mountains ignored them. Paths the villagers had walked for generations vanished as if swallowed by the river. New gullies opened in places where the earth had always been firm. The beast's tracks appeared for a night, then erased themselves as if the mountain rewrote its own skin. Santiago realized the land was not wounded. It was being rearranged. He returned home late one evening to find his daughter waiting. A lamp burned behind her, turning her form into a silhouette, arms folded, hair braided, face unreadable. She asked if he had seen the creature again. He lied and said no. She listened in silence, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The lie hung between them like the scent of rain in a room with no windows. There had been a time when he would have told her everything. How the Nahual's eyes glimmered like embers cupped in black fur. How its gait shifted between animal and man, its limbs adjusting with each step as though deciding which shape it preferred. But fear had become the currency of the town. If he spent any of it on truth, she would pay the cost. So he guarded her as he once guarded the beast's hunger. The following week, the engineers returned, their vehicles spitting exhaust across the mountain road. They carried clipboards, radios, and a project no villager had asked for: a bridge to span the valley. The officials claimed it would protect the region from landslides, ease transport, bring commerce. Their promises traveled like smoke, curling into ears already raw from fright. Some villagers welcomed them. Others warned that digging too deeply would wake something older than stone. Santiago said nothing. He simply watched. The bridge work began at dawn. By mid-morning, chains rattled, drills screamed, and jackhammers burrowed into the earth. The sound was unnatural in the Cedarlands, like lightning trapped in metal. Birds fled. Dogs cowered. Even the wind held its breath. Only one thing moved with confidence: the Nahual. It descended from the high ridge that afternoon. Not in a frenzy, not as a beast defending its territory. It came with the quiet certainty of a king visiting stolen land. Workers did not see it at first. Their eyes were fixed on blueprints and rebar. But the foreman noticed the shift in air, how the temperature dropped, how the leaves stilled, how even the cicadas went silent. It stood on a boulder at the clearing's edge. Fur like nightfall. Limbs nodding and unknotting themselves with unnatural grace. The workers froze. Some tried to speak but produced only fragments of prayer. The foreman dropped his clipboard. One of the younger laborers stepped back, lost footing, and fell into the ravine where the excavators had dug. Blood spattered the stones. The others scattered. The Nahual did not chase them. It looked toward Santiago. He had been walking the old trail, drawn by a chill that pressed against his spine the way a mother presses a hand to a feverish child. When he reached the construction site, the creature had already turned to face him. Workers huddled behind vehicles and crates, trembling with the knowledge that the world was stranger than they had believed an hour earlier. Santiago took one step forward. His voice when it came was low and steady. No more. The beast did not move. Its eyes narrowed, not in threat but in contemplation, as though acknowledging the first time its servant had denied it something. Santiago knew the meaning of that look. The Nahual was no mindless predator. It understood trespass. It understood possession. And it understood betrayal. He knelt. Not out of reverence, but to meet its gaze at equal height. You cannot kill them, he whispered. They will return. And others will come. For a moment he thought the creature did not understand. Then he saw it tilt its head as though listening to a distant drumbeat carried by soil and rock. Perhaps he thought it was not the workers that the Nahual hunted. Perhaps it hunted the change their hands represented. Roads, bridges, concrete, shrines to a new god, prophet. The creature turned away from the cowering men. Its claws dug shallow furrows into the ground as it walked back toward the ridge. When it disappeared into the trees, the forest exhaled again. Birds called. Insects chirped. The world resumed. The workers refused to continue the job. The foreman demanded hazard pay. Radios crackled with instructions to evacuate. Within 2 days the engineers had packed their equipment and driven down the mountain. They blamed the landslide. They blamed funding. They blamed an accident no one could explain. Only Santiago knew the truth. The mountain had rejected their arrival. And the beast that walked its spine had been its answer. That night his daughter asked what had happened. He told her the workers had left. She pressed again. Had he seen it? Had the Nahual taken someone? Had it spoken? Santiago looked at her in the lamplight. A girl almost grown, eyes sharp enough to cut through any lie he spoke. He considered telling her the truth. That the Nahual did not fear the villagers, nor the rifles of soldiers, nor the machines that scraped the soil. It feared something older, something humans had forgotten but carried still. The specific kind of hunger that tore the world apart not for survival but for ambition. He said only this. It fears us because we are not patient. Then he blew out the lamp, and the darkness pressed against the walls like an animal without a cage. The villagers remembered the night the mountain glowed. Not with fire, nor lanterns, nor the crude torches of frightened men. It was a faint shimmer, pale as moonlight and green as drowned moss, pulsing from beneath the earth. It seeped through cracks in the ridge as if the rock itself had veins. They woke to it without knowing why. Dogs whined. Horses reared in their stalls. Infants wailed in their mothers' arms. And Santiago rose from his chair before his daughter could stir, drawn toward the window by a light he had prayed never to see again. The Nahual was awake. Not wandering. Not feeding. Awakening. The glow rippled across the ridgeline, rising in slow breaths. It pulsed like a heartbeat too large to belong to a single creature. Santiago stood barefoot in the doorway, the wind grazing his skin like fingers dipped in ice water. The mountain was shedding its disguise. The beast was no spirit of hunger or vengeance. It was an organ of the land itself, one that had been severed, weakened, and fed on scraps until the storm forced its rebirth. He told his daughter to stay inside. She did not listen. They were halfway up the ridge before he realized she followed him, skirts brushing dew-soaked ground, hair unbound, face pale but determined. She moved without fear, as though she had known all her life that the mountain was waiting. "Do not look at it," he said. "I already have," she replied. The wind bent cedar branches as they climbed. The air thickened, not with heat but pressure, as though the world were narrowing around them. When they reached the overlook, the light had gathered, or rather, converged. Streams of pale green seeped from ravines, gullies, seams in the stone. They moved toward a single clearing deeper in the ridge. The old feeding ground. The Nahual stood in its center. But it was no longer the lithe, shadow-swallowed creature Santiago had known for 40 years. It was larger, broader, its bones bending outward beneath flesh that rippled and shuddered. Its spine flexed in slow waves, vertebrae unfurling like teeth. Claws elongated into something neither paw nor hand. Fur split at places where skin struggled to hold what grew beneath. It was becoming what the earth remembered. Santiago fell to his knees, and his daughter covered her mouth to quiet a scream. The creature's breath steamed in the cold air, each exhale making the ground tremble. He understood then why the mountain feared humans. Not because they hunted. Not because they killed. But because they shaped. They carved. They changed the world faster than beasts or storms or centuries could recover from. The Nahual did not want to devour them. It wanted to become what they had become. Its eyes found him. They held no rage. Only a terrible, simple clarity. It had learned from him. It had watched towns expand, watched bridges built, watched men tear open soil and bend earth to their design. It had seen them harvest mountains the way it harvested flesh. It had seen progress and it hungered for the power behind it. The hunger was no longer for offerings. It was for transformation. Santiago whispered its name one final time, a sound like gravel through teeth, a syllable stolen from elder tongues. The Nahual paused, recognizing the plea of its oldest servant. You fed me, its gaze seemed to say, but you also taught me to grow. He stood, trembling, and stepped forward. His daughter gripped his sleeve, but he shook free. The clearing spread before them like an arena. Mist curled around their ankles. The creature loomed above him, body cracking as its shape strained. Bones pressed against skin like roots bursting through bark. He placed his hand on its chest. The heartbeat beneath his palm was not one pulse, but many, like several hearts vying for dominion. It was not a creature. It was a colony. A pact. A life form built from the fear of generations and the flesh of beasts and men alike. You cannot become us, he whispered. His voice broke. You are not made for ambition. Rain began to hiss from the treetops. No storm, only a drizzle, gentle and cold like the sky had grown pity. The Nahual leaned down. It smelled of iron and wet wood. It pressed its brow to Santiago's shoulder, and for a moment he imagined it understood restraint. Then it tore into him. Not in frenzy. Not in violence. It devoured him the way one harvests the first crop of a new season. Reverent, patient, certain. Its jaws closed around his ribs, tearing flesh with the precision of a butcher carving an animal he had raised. His daughter watched in paralyzed horror as blood steamed on the grass, dark as the soil beneath it. The Nahual swallowed, body shuddering. Santiago's form disappeared piece by piece. The glow pulsed brighter. His daughter did not run. She did not scream. She stepped forward, the rain matting her hair against her skull. One hand rested on the creature's foreleg, trembling but still. The Nahual paused, curious as a newborn. Her voice was steady. If you want to walk like us, you must learn mercy. The creature's head tilted. Bones slid back beneath its skin. Claws retreated. The monstrous torso shrank as though inhaling itself. Its eyes flickered, gold, then ember, then something almost human. It lowered itself. The mountain exhaled. The glow dimmed. By dawn, the Nahual was gone. So was Santiago. The villagers never found a body. Some claimed the storm-washed rivers carried him to the sea. Others whispered he had finally become the monster he fed. Those who saw the glow said nothing at all. They slept with shutters barred and candles lit, praying to a god who never looked toward the ridges. The engineers returned a year later. They brought better machines. More funding. Armed guards. They found the valley quiet. They did not ask why the locals refused to approach the clearing. They did not ask why the cedar trees bent away from it. They did not ask why the birds fell silent when the wind blew from the ridge. They built their bridge. It stands to this day. And at night, when the moon leans low and the mist sinks across the woods, travelers claim to see a figure walking beneath it. A man-shaped silhouette with the gait of something that once crawled, once hunted, once waited. Some say it limps. Some say it lurches. Some say it follows cars until the asphalt fades. But the elders know better. They say the Nahual learned what hunger means in human terms. Not survival, not territory, but the endless, gnawing desire to break the world and rebuild it in one's own image. They say Santiago taught it. And they say the mountain has been quiet ever since. Quiet never means peace. There are parts of the Appalachian night that resemble silence only because the human ear cannot hear what moves within it. The wind threads through reed grass. Beetles gnaw at bark. Roots shift beneath the frost. The ridge, even stripped of its glow, still breathed with the slow pulse of something watching. The villagers who did not know the names of gods or the precise weight of ancient sins, understood only one truth: the hollow ridge was not empty. Santiago's daughter learned this in her first sleepless winter. She lived alone then. The cabin was hers, though no official deed bore her name. No neighbors claimed inheritance or debt. They called her La Huérfana, the orphan, even though she was 23 and carried no tremor in her step. Men offered to help chop wood, repair the roof, deliver sacks of flour, but she refused every gesture. They whispered that she was rude, cursed, touched by madness. Yet none denied her respect when she stared at them with eyes that had seen the ridge flare like the inside of a wound. It was the year the rains came late. The river fell to a thin ribbon of mud. Cattle starved. Corn shriveled at its stalk. The people gathered in the church basement to pray, but even the pastor's voice seemed brittle, as though each plea was an insult hurled at a God who had abandoned them. And still they did not climb the ridge. They fed on hunger before they dared feed the thing they had always feared. Only the daughter knew that the creature was changing. At dusk she watched deer gather near the cedar grove, unafraid. They grazed not with caution but with a tranquil, almost ceremonial stillness. Their heads bowed. Their breath clouded in the air. And when she stepped beyond the tree line, their ears flickered, but they did not flee. They accepted her presence the way pilgrims accept the smoke of incense. The Nahual was among them. She could not see it outright, not the monstrous shape of ribs and teeth, not the eyes like burning resin. Only the outline, the blur at the corner of sight where shadow thickens until it feels dimensional. It hovered in the mist, not stalking but shepherding. Its movement rippled through the deer herd like the flick of a stone across water. They responded as if it were a second moon, guiding them from one meadow to the next. She did not follow. She only watched. The air behind her shifted. An elder approached. Marcos Salazar, a trapper with finger joints like knots from decades of winter. He had once shared whiskey with Santiago in the trading post. He had once delivered chickens to the cabin in exchange for tan pelts. He was the last person still willing to speak the name of the old man without spitting afterward. "You're feeding it," he whispered. She did not turn. He stood behind her like the shadow of a memory, hands buried in his coat, a lantern at his side, wick unlit. "No," she said. "It no longer feeds." He scoffed. His breath danced white in the cold. "You think you stopped hunger by giving it your father?" The words struck her with a weight she had never felt when the creature devoured him. This was no teeth or claw. This was judgment, human, simple, cruel. Her jaw tightened. "I did not give him," she replied. "He offered himself." Marcos inhaled as if to retort, then fell silent. The trees around them rustled without wind, leaves shuddering not from movement above but from a current beneath. The deer lifted their heads in unison. Mist coiled around their hooves like silk. The Nahual turned. They could not see its face. Only the curve of its skull, now more human than wolf, though elongated beyond any earthly anatomy. It watched them through the veil of twilight. The daughter felt its regard, not as the predator she once feared, but as the student who had learned to mimic men. It walked on two legs. The body was deformed, too wide at the shoulders, too narrow at the waist, sinew pulling against skin as though the flesh had not yet accepted its new architecture. Each step cracked the frost like thin glass. Deer parted around it calmly, reverently. Marcos stumbled backward. His lantern slipped from his fingers, falling stunned into the grass. The creature paused. Its head tilted down, no longer towering but bowing. A gesture Santiago himself once used when thanking a guest. The daughter's throat tightened. Her pulse pounded at the base of her skull. The Nahual was not a beast of appetite anymore. It had found something far more dangerous. It had found imitation. The moon scraped through the clouds. Its light slipped across the creature's torso, revealing scars, long diagonal grooves carved by talons or branches or the frantic teeth of its own kin. Some scars were old and silver. Others pink and new, still settling into shape. It seemed to shiver at the touch of the moon, not in fear but in recognition. The planet above governed tides and time. The ridge below governed flesh and myth. The Nahual stood between them, learning the language of both. Marcos broke. He bolted into the underbrush, tripping over vines, swearing he could smell blood on the wind even though none had been spilled. His flight echoed through the forest like the cry of a wounded animal. The deer did not react. They only turned their heads as he vanished, indifferent to the terror of man. The Nahual reached toward the fallen lantern. Its fingers, or talons reshaped into fingers, brushed the handle. The metal did not singe. Its claws did not break. It lifted the lantern with a hesitancy so eerily human that the daughter's breath caught. The creature raised it to eye level, tilting its head as though waiting for flame. She stepped forward. "Let me," she whispered. Her hands lit the wick. The lantern flared. The Nahual recoiled, not in instinctive fear but in recognition. The fire mirrored something it carried within: the glow of the ridge, the pulse of its rebirth, the light of its evolution. The creature stared into the flame, then lowered the lantern to its side. Its spine straightened. Shoulders rolled. Its gait recalibrated. The daughter saw her father. Not his face. Not his flesh. Only his dignity, the rigid posture of a man who believed some burdens were chosen, not given. The Nahual was becoming a memory shaped in muscle. The deer vanished into the mist. The lantern burned between them, its glow seeping into the clearing like a new moon clawing its place in the heavens. In that moment she understood the true danger. A beast that feeds can be negotiated with. But a beast that learns? It will never stop. The villagers waited for Luis to return from Ojo del Muerto, but only the mule came down the path, and even that took 2 days. Its flanks were foamed white, its eyes milked with terror, its hooves cracked as though it had walked 1,000 miles over salt. The saddle was stained with tar-black streaks, no blood but something worse, as if the animal had leaned its ribs against the spine of something half-formed, half-starved, and alive with teeth. When they tried to calm it, it snapped its reins and galloped toward the river until the current swallowed it. They never found its body. By then the town's nights had changed. They were no longer ruled by the distant cries of coyotes or the wind across maize fields. Instead came the sound of bone hands tapping shutters. Alone it sounded like a trick of trees and gusts. But entire streets heard it, 4, 6, then 20 pairs of knuckles knocking at doors. Those who opened found nothing. Those who refused woke to circles of claw marks on their walls, inches deep, like the walls had been scraped by something starving for a way in. The elders said the Nahual had been fed too long, that it no longer remembered its boundaries. It was a dog to Luis for 40 years, and dogs that live on meat do not go back to herbs. They do not go back to moonlight or prayer. They only evolve sharper hunger. And hunger, once freed, remembers every path carved into its past. The first to vanish was the miller's son. He was a meek boy who spent his days sharpening grainstones and his nights counting stars behind the chapel. His body was found 3 days later hanging from the ceiling beams of his family's storage shed, except the rope was not rope. It was his own spine pulled through his back like thread. No one touched him. Not for burial. Not for prayer. They burned the entire shed. But the fire didn't burn clean. It licked the night in green tongues, casting long shadows in every direction, like 20 wolves running around a single flame. One of the women fainted. 2 swore they smelled wet dog breath against the back of their necks. The priest told them it was the devil and urged them to repent. The mothers reminded him the devil had no business in the Sierra Madre until Luis brought it down from the ridge. The second disappearance was the twin sisters, Adela and Hortensia. They walked the orchard paths at dusk to gather fallen fruit. Their baskets were found lying in the dirt, each holding the same incomplete harvest: 3 apples, 4 figs, 1 pear. Not scattered, placed carefully, as though someone had set them down with reverence or with ritual. Some men reported that the orchard trees had been stripped of bark in a single spiral, each trunk peeled down to its marrow. They said the trunks looked like pale bones driven into the ground. The priest told them not to look. But all of them had already looked and none of them forgot. Rumors spread that Luis had returned and was hiding in the mountains. The men formed search parties, torches in hand, rifles over shoulders. They whispered to one another that if they found him, they'd drag him back to town and demand answers. But none of them said what they'd do if they found what he had fed. They searched the slopes above the ravine where parrots nested, the jagged paths where burros broke legs, the creeks that chewed stone and spat gravel. They followed trails of bones, chicken necks, dog paws, and once the skull of a mule still fresh with sinew. The farther they went, the more the bones pointed uphill like an arrow, like an altar. Some wanted to continue. Others noticed their torches dimming, almost as if the air itself was swallowing fire. Then they heard the first growl. It was not loud. It was not close. But it was low enough to bend their knees with fear, a rumble that vibrated inside their ribs. They fled before they had seen anything. When they reached the village, they did not speak of courage again. Soon the elders held a council. They called on every house to stay shuttered at night, even during the hottest weather, even when the storms rolled in and lightning wanted entry. They said no one should walk alone, no one should travel after dusk, and if any living thing knocked on your door, you must pretend to be dead. Real animals know the difference. Monsters don't care. Weeks passed. The mountain fog thickened. The dogs stopped barking. The poultry laid no eggs. Every living creature felt the silence closing over them like burlap over a corpse. Until one night, A sound split the air that was not claw or bone or wind. It was singing. A single voice drifted from the mountainside, as gentle as a lullaby sung to a newborn. Patient. Familiar. The tune was Luis's. The same melody he used to hum while walking the paths at dawn, a song without words that belonged to the trees and the dew, a song he said the Nahual liked. The children thought it was beautiful. The adults thought it was dangerous. The singing moved through the streets like smoke. Some followed it to their windows entranced. Others locked themselves in their rooms. Something about the melody felt wrong, like a human voice stretched over an animal's throat. In the center of town, beneath the fountain that had not worked in years, a shadow stood taller than any man, thicker than any beast. It held its head low as though sniffing the earth. The villagers could not see its eyes, only its outline. Shoulders like fallen trees, limbs like twisted branches, back arched in the posture of a wolf stalking its prey. It sang. One farmer swore he saw something dangling from its jaws, a long strip of cloth, embroidered with flowers. Adela and Hortensia always embroidered flowers. The shadow turned to look at him. No one saw what happened next, but they found him the next morning, kneeling at the fountain, head tilted back, eyes missing. His chest was unmarked. His hands held nothing. But every tooth in his mouth had been removed, one by one, without breaking the lips. The priest broke then. He locked the chapel doors and left town the next day before dawn. His mule survived not even half the journey. The scavengers did the rest. That was when the villagers finally spoke aloud what they had been fearing. The Nahual was no longer a legend. It had returned to collect its debt, and, lacking Luis, it would claim the rest of them for interest. And the mountain waited, patient as a starving god, for the next offering. The elders could not agree who should speak first, so no one did. They gathered in the abandoned cantina, the one whose floorboards still smelled of spilled mezcal and tobacco, and waited for someone to accept the weight of blame. The wind outside was restless, scraping dust along the windows like a broom of bones. Every face there was drawn in the same grim mask of sleeplessness, eyes bruised with fear, shoulders bowed with resignation. For the first time in living memory, even the oldest among them admitted they did not know the answer. A light tremor rolled through the rafters as though the building itself breathed. Then another. Not thunder, not earthquakes. Those came with warnings from the earth. This was lighter, stranger, like a predator testing the walls of their meeting place. The old woman who raised the miller's boy crossed herself, though her hand shook each time she touched her brow. She whispered that the Nahual was hungry for elders now, that the youth had only been the appetizer. Her words turned the air sour. The men spoke of making offerings. Goats, they said. Or cattle. Something large, something with blood and muscle and fat that could satisfy the beast's craving. But offerings to a creature that had already tasted human flesh meant nothing. It was like tossing warm bread to a hurricane. The beast did not want livestock. It wanted history, lineage, memory, everything that was entwined in a human body. A voice rasped from the shadows at the far end of the room. You cannot feed something that no longer eats. They turned and saw him, Rodrigo the river ferryman, back bent, hair thin as spider silk. His beard was white enough to glow beneath the cantina lanterns. He had ferried coffins for half a century, across waters swollen with ghosts. He was the only man who knew the crossings every family would one day take. So when he spoke, they listened. It does not want flesh, he said. It wants the hunger of flesh. It wants what men take from themselves when they break their promises. No one understood. So he explained. Luis had not fed the creature because he loved it, nor because he feared it. He fed it because the Nahual was not a beast at all. It was the punishment of a failed pact, one older than the town itself. There was once a people who marked their births with midnight bloodletting. They cut their arms under moonlight and offered the blood to the mountain so the mountain would remain asleep. They fed the land so that its jaws would stay buried in stone. Luis was the last descendant of them. His father taught him. His grandfather taught his father. The pact was never to kill the mountain, never to tame it, never to command it. The pact was simply to remind the mountain that humans remembered their place. But Luis broke it. He stopped offering blood. He fed the Nahual meat instead. And in replacing fear with convenience, he taught the mountain a new appetite. The ferryman's words crawled into them like worms. They shook their heads. They denied it. They begged for something simpler: witchcraft, sorcery, curses from travelers. Anything but the truth that their salvation had been born of discipline, not brutality, and that once that discipline was abandoned, the mountain reclaimed its ancient memory. They asked Rodrigo why it sang at night if hunger ruled it. He told them the truth none of them wanted to hear. The Nahual was calling for its master. Not the man. The blood. It could smell the descendants, the ones hidden among them, the ones who bore the lineage of the pact breaker, the ones who still carried a thin echo of the ancestral promise in their veins. And once it found them, it would feed until earth and sky were equal in their emptiness. A woman screamed then, not inside the cantina but outside, somewhere in the plaza. A single wail, high and sharp, cut through the silence like a needle through flesh. The men bolted to the door, pulling it open, lantern flames jittering in their wake. There, at the base of the dried fountain, knelt a girl no older than 9. Her dress was soaked in river water. Her hands cupped something small and pale. When the elders approached, they saw it was a bundle of teeth. Not human. Not animal. Smooth, porous, ivory-colored fragments. The girl lifted her face to them and they recoiled. Her cheeks were swollen, almost bruised, as if someone had pressed fingers into them again and again. But worse still were her eyes. They were not terrified. They were calm, blank, as if she were somewhere between dream and death. It asked me to carry these, she said. No one dared ask who it was. They already knew. The ferryman took a lantern and knelt. He examined the teeth, too long, too thin, curved like hooks. They belonged to the mountain. The girl had carried the weapons of the Nahual into town like an offering from the jaws of a god. When she stood, her legs trembled. The elders noticed her shadow stretched behind her in 2 directions, not one. One shadow was hers, small, narrow, human. The other was too long, as if something enormous leaned just out of sight. The lantern flame guttered as if choking on wind that did not exist. Rodrigo whispered that the beast no longer hunted blindly. It had found its way inside the village, not as a wolf, not as a man, but as a whisper inside the youngest heart. The Nahual had learned patience. It had learned how to wait. The girl walked away, silent, like someone being led by an unseen leash. No one followed. Not even her mother. The town slept that night with candles in windows, doors barricaded, prayers recited until tongues blistered. But the candles melted long before dawn, and the prayers did not carry past the walls. The mountain only breathed, and its breath rolled through every corridor, every street, every bed where terrified humans tried to pretend they were safe. By morning, the elders had made their decision. They would go into the mountains. Not to hunt. Not to trap. Not to fight. They would find Luis or what was left of him. They would find the remnants of the broken pact. And they would face whatever waited on the slopes, as one answers a debt past due. The mountains looked different when one approached them with fear. They were not the familiar silhouettes seen from the fields or from the roofs of adobe houses. Up close, the slopes appeared like ribs of some buried leviathan rising through the earth, dark stone glistening in the gloom. The elders, 12 in number, began their ascent before dawn, when the horizon was a bruise of purple and ash. They carried no torches. The wind would have devoured their flames. Instead, they walked with the slow obedience of mourners following a coffin. Their feet crushed brittle brush, roots, and loose gravel. Each step was an argument between gravity and resolve. The oldest among them, Rodrigo, leaned on his oar-shaped cane, carved from riverwood, polished by a lifetime of ferrying the dead. He did not slow. His breathing was quiet, measured, as though he had marched this route long before the others were even born. Some said he had. Some said he ferried more than bodies. Every 100 paces they stopped, not from exhaustion but to listen. They listened not for birds or wolves or shifting rock. Those were natural sounds, harmless in their own way. They listened instead for a sound like whispered thunder, or a heartbeat made of wind. The Nahual did not howl. It murmured. Its footsteps were not impact but echo. It did not move like something with flesh. It moved like something remembering. The first landmark rose from the mountain throat, an abandoned shrine, its stone blackened by time and smoke. At its center lay a bowl of carved obsidian, cracked across the middle. They approached it slowly. Rodrigo knelt, brushing his fingers along the rim. The bowl was stained. Not fresh blood. Years settled in layers like forgotten paint. The elders saw the streak marks, the way the stains stopped abruptly at the fractured line. The pact had been broken here. The last ritual cut had spilled in this very bowl. And then, Luis had turned away and given the mountain something else. The bowl had not broken from earthquake or weather. It had split from hunger denied its due. They offered no prayers. The mountain had no use for them and they were too late for apologies. The elders continued their climb, voices swallowed by the fog. It moved like breathing cloth, winding between their bodies, stretching across rocks, wrapping their legs. The wind carried no scent, only a chill that felt alive. Halfway to the ridge, the earth beneath them darkened. At first it looked like shadow, then soil burned black, then something more unsettling, feathers. Thousands of them, flattened in the dirt, brittle and broken. Some were white, others gray, others still black with iridescent glimmers. A few stuck upright as if planted. No bird covered the ground like this naturally. These were bartered feathers, forsaken offerings, the useless currency of desperate villagers who believed the Nahual might accept wings in place of blood. People tried to cheat it, Rodrigo said. His voice shook neither with pity nor contempt. It remembers. A howl would have been mercy. Instead, they heard a stirring that was colder than silence itself, a raking sigh that passed above them without body. The men crouched. They clutched rosaries and daggers. Some pressed their palms to the ground as though the earth was safer than the sky. Rodrigo did not crouch. He looked upward and waited for the unseen thing to pass. Nothing showed itself, but the bones within their bodies trembled. Tiny veins in their hands throbbed. Their hearts did not beat faster. They beat wrong, out of rhythm, staggered by something unseen. The Nahual did not attack. It caressed their pulses like a surgeon, learning where their lives could be pulled loose. When the trembling ceased, they rose and continued. The path steepened. Stones cut their ankles. The fog thickened like coagulated milk. Their lungs burned. The slope forced their bodies into a slow, brutal crawl, as though the mountain demanded they kneel. Just as dawn reached the edges of the horizon, they saw it. A hut clinging to a cliff face, its walls stitched with saplings and rope, its roof sagging like tired shoulders. Luis's refuge. Or his prison. The elders approached cautiously. No birds perched on the branches above it. No insects droned. The mountain had killed sound. Rodrigo lifted his cane and touched the door. It swung inward without resistance. No hinges creaked, not from oil but because the wood was too dry to complain. Inside, the floor had been carefully cleaned. Not swept, scrubbed. The boards shone beneath a thin film of wax, though there was no candlelight, no hearth glow. What little illumination filtered in from the door revealed a single table and 2 chairs. The chairs faced each other. On one sat a figure with its back to them. On the other sat nothing at all. Luis, Rodrigo whispered. The figure did not move. They circled the table. Luis sat with his hands folded, palms up, as if presenting his emptiness. His face had withered into a skull's imitation. His cheeks hung as though hollowed from within. His eyes were open, but the pupils were not eyes. They were small black holes, tunnels bored through flesh and memory. He was not alive, and yet death had not claimed him. He looked like a man who had tried to starve himself but could not finish. On the table rested a knife of obsidian. Its blade was smooth. Its edge still carried a red shimmer, the kind that no years could dull. The elders knew at once. This was the knife that should have fed the bull. Rodrigo sat opposite the corpse. He did not touch it. He looked instead at the empty chair. Its seat was covered in dried mud. Not dirt from the path. Mud that came from beneath river water. Mud that smelled faintly like iron and herbs. There were 2, Rodrigo murmured. One elder asked who sat there. Rodrigo closed his eyes. The Nahual. Not as beast. As guest. The room tightened. The wind outside fell still. The elders realized why the mountains had not swallowed Luis whole. He had been kept alive as punishment, a host for the hunger he refused to honor. The creature had fed from him slowly, like a vine drinking from a dying tree. Not to kill him. To feed on his lineage. The ferryman leaned forward and spoke to the corpse. We are here to end this. For the first time since their climb, silence responded not like absence, but like listening. The hut inhaled. Then the mountain exhaled. The exhale shook the hut as if the mountain itself were rousing from a long, reluctant sleep. The elders staggered back, their boots scraping across the polished floor. Dust drifted from the rafters, spiraling like pale moths above their heads before dissolving in the dark air. Rodrigo did not flinch. His gaze was still fixed on Luis, as if waiting for the corpse to speak a final confession. But it was not the dead man that stirred, it was the table he sat before. The obsidian blade shivered. Not rattling or clattering but humming the way a tuning fork trembles when struck against bone. Its black surface rippled with faint light, the way moonlight trembles in deep water. The elders drew their knives and crosses. Rodrigo raised neither. He only set his palm flat on the wood as though calming a restless child. We are guests, he murmured. It remembers hospitality. The hut's walls creaked inward, wood bending as if under a great weight. A pressure filled the air that was not wind or gravity. It was like the ache before a scream, sound trapped in a throat too ancient to form words. One elder collapsed to his knees and clutched his ribs. Another pressed his forehead to the floor. Their lungs rebelled, refusing to draw air. The Nahual was not in the room, it was the room. It seeped through the grain of the timber, the knots of the boards, the cracks between planks. It listened through wood. It breathed through dust. Rodrigo closed his eyes. We know your hunger. We know how it began. We are not thieves. We come with memory. Only then did the pressure lessen, not because the creature relented, but because it turned its attention to him. The others felt it immediately, a weight sliding from their shoulders and gathering on his. The air around him thickened. Fine strands of darkness rose from the cracks like smoke drawn upward through the ribs of a dying fire. The shadows gathered above his head, circling as if smelling him. The wind found its way back into the hut. It did not arrive through the door. It seeped through the seams of the roof. It pulled at strands of white hair on Rodrigo's scalp and lifted the edges of Luis's lifeless clothing. For a moment the corpse seemed about to move. The elders braced, weapons trembling in their hands. But Luis remained still, eyes fixed on nothing, lips parted like a man who had died mid-sentence. The shadows concentrated over the empty chair. It was strange how a thing could take shape without ever becoming visible. The light around the seat bent, warped as though pressed by invisible fingers. A human silhouette suggested itself, long torso, elongated limbs, head crowned by tangled strands of something not quite hair and not quite feathers. Then the illusion fractured, spreading like ash blown across water. Darkness lacked patience when it was hungry. Rodrigo reached for the obsidian blade. His fingers curled around the hilt like a priest handling a relic. The knife hummed louder as if recognizing him. The gathered darkness recoiled. This was not defiance but ritual. The elders had brought more than breath and courage, they had brought lineage. He sliced his palms slowly, letting the blood fall not onto the bowl, nor onto the floor but onto the table between them. The drop landed with a quiet sound like a seed tapping soil. The shadows froze. Do not feed from the living, Rodrigo said. Feed from the oath. The mountain trembled. Not violently, subtly like the first tremor of a heart waking from a long sleep. A wind rushed down the slope and through the door, carrying the smell of wet stone and ancient feathers. It circled the hut like a wolf deciding how to kill. The elders trembled. One whispered a prayer to the Virgin. Another muttered the name of an older god, one not spoken in polite company. But Rodrigo remained calm. The blood on his palm darkened, thickening into a thread. It slid downward as though pulled by unseen gravity, forming a narrow line that pointed toward Luis's body. The Nahual surged. It did not scream because screams belonged to throats. Instead, the room shook with the sound of feathers brushing together, thousands at once, forming a choir of rustling wings. The hut darkened. The shadows collapsed inward, congealing around Luis's corpse. His shoulders lifted. His head jerked. His lips cracked, revealing teeth stained yellow by decades of starvation. Luis stood. The elders backed against the walls. Their weapons hung uselessly from their trembling hands. His joints did not move like a once living man's. They bent the wrong way with slow reluctance, as though every bone were a hinge placed by the wrong god. He turned toward Rodrigo. His empty eyes met the ferryman's, and for the first time the others understood why Rodrigo had never spoken of his youth. Luis was not his neighbor. Not his acquaintance. He was his brother. The Nahual had not abandoned Luis. It had hollowed him. It had worn him the way a hunter wears a pelt. A sound issued from his mouth, a wet rasp like river stones grinding underwater. The language was older than Spanish, older than the Empire, older than the first canoe that cut through the valley. Rodrigo listened, though he understood none of it. Meaning arrived without words. You will not take another son, Rodrigo whispered. Luis's spine twitched. The Nahual lunged. Rodrigo raised the obsidian blade. He moved not like a warrior but like a man sealing a tomb. He drove the knife upward beneath Luis's ribs, into the space where a heart might have been, if the creature still allowed him one. The body convulsed. The hut wailed. The walls rippled as if wooden planks had lungs. Feathers exploded through the air, black, gray, white, spiraling like a storm stripped of its sky. The elders shielded their eyes. Wind howled through the hut, whipping the feathers into vortexes that clawed at flesh and cloth. Rodrigo held on to the blade. The vessel collapsed to its knees. The shadows scattered. The darkness fled the chair. The floor drank the spilled blood like dry soil taking rain. Luis gasped. Not like a revenant but like a man who had been underwater for 40 years. Rodrigo caught him before he fell. The others dared not speak. Because the mountain had gone silent again. The elders did not sleep that night. Sleep belonged to men who trusted mornings, and none of them trusted dawn after what they had seen. They paced the courtyards of their adobe homes, stared at the sky, at the mountain, at their hands. Some washed their faces in cold water, hoping it would rinse away memory. Others refused to bathe at all, believing water might carry remnants of the Nahual back into their skin. They were men raised on ritual, and ritual was the last weapon they still understood. Rodrigo did not go home. He walked through the village as the horizon softened from blue to ash. A rooster crowed once, then fell silent as if startled by its own audacity. The old ferryman paused to rest beneath the fig tree at the edge of the plaza. He leaned against his cane. Not because he needed its support but because memory had weight and it was heavier than bone. When the sun finally crept above the ridge, every window shutter was closed. Dogs slept beneath carts. Mothers ushered children indoors, locking doors that were never locked. Not even when winter storms growled across the desert. A strange quiet settled over the village, the kind that arrives not after tragedy, but after a promise no one wanted. By noon the authorities arrived. They came not for the Nahual because authorities do not hunt what they cannot name, nor for truth because truth seldom travels in uniform. They came for the missing. For Luis's body. For answers their ledgers demanded, not their souls. The sheriff dismounted, his boots echoing against the stones as if each step were hammering nails into a coffin. He asked questions the elders would never answer. Who was there? What happened in the hut? Why was the corpse pierced through the throat? They listened without listening and spoke without speaking. Rodrigo alone stepped forward. He told them the truth and yet not truth. He said the man had returned after many years away, changed and deranged by solitude, driven to depravity by voices that no one else could hear. He said the elders had found him in madness, carving his own throat with a ceremonial blade. He said nothing about shadow, hunger, or death sealed in blood. The sheriff believed enough of the lie to nod. Madness was acceptable. Folklore was not. They carried Luis's body to the cemetery. The elders followed, heads bowed. They did not hold a proper service. They did not pray. They simply watched as the coffin was lowered, as the soil consumed the last trace of the Nahual's vessel. Rodrigo stood apart from them, arms folded, eyes fixed on the ridge. The wind rattled the dry grass like a hand sifting bones. It did not howl. It did not speak. It listened. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning the animals in the village began to change. First, the dogs refused to enter the shade. They stood in direct sunlight as though cold had rooted itself in their limbs. Their eyes tracked unseen movements. They barked at empty doorways, growled at corners that once held nothing but dust. Then goats began refusing the trough. They trembled when the wind shifted. Their bodies pressed against fences, trying to escape something that none of the villagers could see. The elders gathered again, this time in the chapel. They lit candles. They prayed to saints whose names sounded small in the face of old gods. They debated whether they had made a mistake, whether the creature that fed on the Tremont line could feed now on animals, on children, on them. Fear had a strange way of turning resolve into superstition. Their voices quivered, not with cowardice but with doubt. Rodrigo did not join them. He sat at the riverbank, his cane resting across his knees. He watched the water slip between stones, slow and brown as blood diluted by time. He whispered to the current in a language older than his tongue. He did not ask for protection or forgiveness. He spoke of balance, of the way the river accepted bodies without judgment, whether drowned by storm or by choice. The river, unlike men, did not fear hunger. A boy approached him at dusk. Barefoot, thin, eyes too wide for his face. He carried a satchel of flowers, marigolds wilted from heat. He did not speak at first. He looked at Rodrigo as if studying an oracle whose answers were legend, not speech. "My grandmother says the Nahual follows feeders," the boy murmured. Rodrigo lifted his gaze. "She says you fed it," he continued. "Not with blood. With the dead." The ferryman said nothing. He looked at the river again as though searching for the reflection of a beast long gone. The boy sat beside him, legs dangling off the bank. His toes brushed the surface of the water. The current pulled gently as if greeting him. "Do you believe your grandmother?" Rodrigo asked. The boy thought. His lips parted, then closed. Finally he shook his head. "No. I think she's afraid," he said. "And people who are afraid always tell stories." Rodrigo smiled, but not kindly. "Everyone who saw that night will become a story," he replied. "Even me." The boy nodded. He plucked a petal from his marigold and let it fall into the river. The current carried it away. "What about the Nahual?" the child whispered. Rodrigo leaned forward, cane tapping against stone. "It will rest," he said, "until someone wakes it again." The boy frowned. "Who would do that?" Rodrigo did not answer. Later, when the moon was high and the chapel candles burned low, whispers unfurled across the village, not spoken ones but remembered ones. No one saw the Nahual. No claws tore the sky. No shadow crept across rooftops. Yet the elders felt something beneath their floors, beneath their beds, beneath the valley itself. The wind had changed again. It moved the way lungs do when exhaling relief, not hunger. It rustled crops instead of bones. Children slept without nightmares. Goats drifted back to their troughs. Dogs curled beneath porches. For the first time since Luis's death, dawn arrived without fear. People claimed it was coincidence. Others said Rodrigo had banished a demon from their land. A few whispered that the Nahual had been nothing more than grief given fangs and feathers. None of them visited the hut again. None touched the obsidian blade sealed in the sheriff's office. None asked where the shadow had gone. But the mountain remembered. And mountains do not forget. Not when blood has been offered. Not when hunger has been sated. Not when the living believe they have bargained with the dead. The village slept. Somewhere beneath the ridge something waited. And waiting was its oldest craft. By the eve of the 11th year of the curse, the mountains stopped whispering. It was the silence that frightened old shepherds more than any howl. Vulcan Santa Eulalia breathed slow plumes of ash, the way a dying animal exhaled after being struck. I arrived at Antonio's home only once more, and the house had changed. Curtains woven from agave fiber replaced paper window sheets. Candles, dozens of them, crowded every corner of the entryway. Wax had cascaded down the walls like frozen tears. And beneath the table, curled between feathered talismans, the Nahual slept without a body, only its pelt, folded and trembling as if it dreamed. Antonio looked as thin as I had ever seen him. When he moved, his clothes followed like the clothes of a ghost, not a man. He motioned for me to sit beside the table, across from the pelt. He spoke with the same half-whisper he used when reciting the mountain's warnings. What he told me then was not a confession, nor a plea. It was something closer to a diary being read aloud by its author in the final hour before sleep. He said the Nahual was dying. Not from hunger, it had eaten well enough, he insisted. He had fed it rabbits, goats, even the occasional stray dog. Meat was not the issue. Its illness was something older, more spiritual. The Nahual no longer recognized those who fed it. The boy whose face it once wore was now too far from memory. Its hunger was no longer for flesh, but for lineage. That was the word he used, lineage. I asked what that meant and he did not answer. He took the candle nearest the pelt and held its flame near the edge of the fur. The air shimmered and for a moment I thought the skin recoiled. I remembered the warnings from the elders near Zilitla, that fire was the only thing the Nahual feared, for it reminded the spirit of the day the sun was born, and the day all shadows were made subordinate. I asked him if he planned to burn it. He shook his head. Fire would not free him, he said. Only the return of memory could do that. Antonio's hair had turned from rain-cloud black to the color of bone. His eyes had become two pieces of glass, reflecting everything and revealing nothing. He told me the Nahual was not a guardian, not a monster, but a bridge. A bridge between what the land once demanded and what the new world insisted upon. He told me he had not fed it because he was afraid of it, he had fed it because he feared what would replace it if it died. The mountains had become quiet in the years of his service. The storms had struck gently. The soil had produced more maize than the village could remember. He believed the Nahual held those balances in its claws. He lifted the pelt from beneath the table. It draped over his arms with the reluctant weight of wet cloth. He invited me to touch it. I wished to decline, but curiosity overcame caution. My fingertips met the fur and I expected warmth. Instead it felt like chilled river stones, smooth and lifeless. The longer I touched it, the colder it grew, as though it was hollowing its temperature through my hand. I pulled away before it could burrow deeper. Antonio did not flinch. He pressed his face into the pelt, breathing as though trying to inhale its memories. His body shivered, not like a man trembling, but like a vessel being filled with something it could not hold. When he spoke again his voice was different. Not deeper, not higher, simply older. Like the echo of someone who had already died. He said the Nahual once spoke to him. Not in words but in visions. It showed him the shape of the child it had once been, the boy who had fallen beneath the river's ice in 1875, the one whose parents had offered prayers to the old gods when the church refused to bury him in consecrated ground. The gods answered only halfway. They did not return the child. Instead, they returned the hunger that remembered him. A hunger that required care. A hunger that found its way to Antonio's family because his ancestors were the last to bow to the mountains before the missionaries came. He told me he was chosen not because he was strong, but because he was consistent. The Nahual needed someone who would not question, who would not attempt to define its purpose. For 40 years he did not ask why. But age gave him a new kind of bravery, the bravery of exhaustion. He began to wonder what would happen when he was gone. Would the hunger search for another caretaker? Would it reclaim the child lost beneath the ice and roam again? Or would it be reborn into the body of someone living, someone unprepared? These thoughts poisoned him. The dreams came. First intermittent, then nightly, then every hour he tried to rest. In them, the Nahual sat beside him in human form, no longer a child but a man wearing the pelt like a cloak of skin. It had a jaw full of teeth that clicked as it breathed, as if counting. Its eyes were mirrors. In every dream it would turn its head, stare at him through the reflection of himself, and whisper without sound, "You have not finished." Antonio stopped eating. He stopped bathing. He stopped going to the river. The villagers assumed he was ill. Some believed he had finally seen the devil in the shape of the creature he had fed. Others prayed the sickness would not leap from his house to theirs. No one dared approach him. Even the priest avoided his door, pretending not to notice the candles that burned day and night. The day before I arrived that last time, something happened. Antonio heard footsteps outside his window, human, young, hesitant. He thought the new caretaker had come. He opened the door and found no one. Only the wind, carrying the smell of iron. He swore he heard a voice belonging to the Nahual, but not the old voice. A new one. The voice of a boy asking if it was time to return. Antonio said he understood then. The Nahual did not fear us because we were stronger. It feared us because memory belonged to us. We could bury children and lands and gods. We could forget what we once promised. And the forgotten hungers were always the ones that returned. At dawn on the 12th day I returned to Antonio's home. The sky was milk white, and the mist hung so low that the roof beams looked submerged beneath it. I knocked once, then twice. The door opened without a hand. Inside, the candles had gone out. The walls were bare. The table was missing. Only the floor remained, covered by a single object. The Nahual's pelt, curled into a perfect circle like a sleeping serpent. I called his name. No answer. There was no scent of decay, no hint of a struggle. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt prepared. I stepped inside, the boards gently sighing beneath my weight. The pelt twitched at the sound as though something inside it inhaled. I knelt beside it, hesitant, and reached for the corner of its fur. It was warm now, as if a pulse beat beneath it. Not the cold stone sensation I remembered. Something had returned to it. The wind outside shifted. The windows rattled, not violently but rhythmically, as though someone tapped them with a child's knuckles. Then a voice, distant but unmistakable, came from the hallway. Not Antonio's tired rasp. A younger tone, clear and tremulous like someone relearning language. "We're home." The words did not command. They did not threaten. They simply existed, as if spoken by someone whose life had never contained silence until now. I turned and saw him. He was smaller than I remembered Antonio being as a youth, more slender, barefoot, hair black and dripping like he had just risen from the river. His eyes were the color of moonlit water. No shadows clung to him. The darkness curled at his feet like a pet unsure of its master. He stepped forward and the pelt responded. It lifted without hands, settling across his shoulders. The fur fused with his skin, not merging but accepting, like a garment woven from the body's own past. When he breathed, the pelt breathed. When he blinked, its ears flickered. I recognized neither beast nor boy, only a union of both, a memory shaped into flesh. I asked him where Antonio was. His head tilted with a curious softness. He did not answer with words. The silence grew heavy, the way earth weighs on a coffin. Then he turned his palm upward, revealing a strand of white hair wrapped around a knot of leather. Not a trophy. Not a threat. A trace of something finished. Something that no longer needed to feed. The pelt shimmered with low motion, like fur brushed by invisible wind. The boy closed his fist, crushing the hair, and the mist outside trembled. I heard a sound then, one I had never known the Nahual to make. A sigh. Soft, exhausted, relieved. He walked toward the door, legs steady, movements gentle. Not hungry. Not lost. I followed him to the threshold. Outside, the soil was wet, but it held no footprints. He stepped across the earth as though every stone had waited for his weight. Birds perched on the thorn bushes watched in silence. Even the volcano's smoke paused, as if unsure whether it was witnessing the end or the beginning of something older than its own ash. I asked again, quieter, "What do you want?" This time he spoke without looking at me. "To remember." The words were not for me, not truly. They were spoken to the sky, to the spine of the mountain, to the unseen paths of the dead. The pelt shifted, curling around him like a cloak of nightfall, and his body changed, not violently, not grotesquely. The transformation was steady, like frost melting beneath spring water. Bones stretched, legs bent. His spine elongated until his head lowered toward the earth, halfway between man and creature. His face reshaped, muzzle forming, teeth lengthening just enough to remind me that the wildness had never been separate from him. It had simply waited. He held the shape of memory, not human, not beast. The Nahual walked past me, its tail brushing my ankle. I did not flee. I did not scream. Fear was not the appropriate response. Reverence was. He turned once, gaze sharp with a new awareness. I understood then the truth Antonio had sheltered all his life. The Nahual was not born from hunger. It was born from remembrance. A bridge, yes, but bridges do not exist to be crossed once. They exist so that both sides may remain connected. The creature moved toward the woods, slow at first, then faster. Leaves parted. Branches did not break under its passing, they bowed. The soil swallowed the sound of its pause. And before the mist closed behind it, I saw something woven between its steps, the shape of a boy wearing the body of a myth, no longer frightened of forgetting. I remained in the doorway until dusk. Villagers came and asked if I had seen Antonio. I told them he was gone, and the mountains had taken him back. They accepted the answer the way people accept rain, without gratitude, without resentment, as an inevitability. They lit candles as night fell and did not ask why the earth felt suddenly heavier beneath their feet. Weeks later, on the road out of Santa Eulalia, I passed a shepherd tending his goats. He spoke of something that moved through the fields at dawn, herding stray animals away from ravines, scattering wolves before they reached the flocks. He said it did not eat. It did not harm. It only watched, like an ancestor who had returned to ensure his descendants remembered how to stand upright against the wind. I asked if anyone feared it. The shepherd laughed, a tired sound with the warmth of embers. Fear was for strangers, he said. The creature was not a stranger. It had lived here longer than any of them. Longer than the missionaries. Longer than the roads. Longer than the graves whose names had faded. The mountains had simply given it a body again. I walked on, leaving the shepherd and his goats behind. The road curved around the volcano's base, where the mist settled like smoke from an invisible hearth. For the first time since meeting Antonio, the mountains did not feel hungry. They felt calm. Perhaps that is what the Nahual had feared, not our strength nor our cruelty, but our ability to forget the promise that birthed it. If this tale found you tonight, let it rest with a like, and wake again with a subscribe.